Hi, Juliana. Hi, everybody. Welcome back from the spring break. I hope you had a good reading break and had a nice little rest for yourselves before we start the last part of the term. Um, we just are going to start today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the midterm and then the final coming up. But before we start, we have Juliana Geno, who is going to be doing a survey with you. So I'll let Juliana explain what this is about.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Suzanne, for the opportunity. So I'm doing a climate education initiative with a professor here at UBC called Fernanda Tomazelli and a couple other students. And we need to get as many responses as possible for our survey from as many students as possible. And it's literally the quickest survey you'll ever fill out. It's 2 yes/no questions. So I please ask each one of you to answer. I'm gonna share the screen here. If you could please answer right now, it would be very, very helpful. Just answer yes, no, and if you want, leave a quick comment. It would be super helpful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Juliana. I hope everybody that you're able to do this. I think it's a really important question. So yeah, take a second to do the survey. Okay. But before we get into this fascinating topic of species interactions, which I know you want to know a lot about, let's talk about the final and the midterm first. So we're making great progress with marking the midterm, and we will be finished this week. And so we'll be returning your grades on March the 3rd. So yeah, thanks for your patience with that. Regarding the final exam, so the final exam has been set for April 23rd at 3:30 p.m. It is an online exam, just as the midterm was an online exam. It'll be the same process using Lockdown browser. And so the time that UBC Central allocated for this exam on April 23rd is at 3:30 p.m. However, we're going to have a lot more flexibility. We'll have the exam open for you to do between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. on April 23rd. It's a 2-hour exam, so you'll have 2 hours to complete your questions. But there's a lot of flexibility in there as to when you do your exam. So you can pick any 2-hour period in that 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. stretch of time. You don't have to be here in person. I know that some of you were confused because when the exam schedule came out, it said it's an in-person exam. It is not an in-person exam. It's an online exam, just as the midterm was. So the final exam is it's not a cumulative exam. In other words, it's only going to include the lectures from the midterm forward, plus the lecture by Dr. Yunus Alila about hydrology. So you don't need to study the stuff that you studied already prior to the midterm. You just need to focus on the materials that were presented from Dr. Alila forward. So we're going to have some more guest lectures coming up, some really great ones. I think you'll really enjoy them. And I wanted to just mention that all of the material from those guest lectures will be testable. So questions will appear on the final exam from those guest lectures. So you need to, still pay attention. We will provide you with a study guide before the final, just like we did right before the midterm. It'll be the same kind of format. It'll, provide the learning objectives and then the key concepts or the key words that define those lectures. So if you follow that, you'll do fine. Yeah, and just to talk a little bit about the format. The format is going to be a lot like the midterm. So here's what we're going to include. We'll have, and so you can write these things down. And of course, we will post this as well on Canvas. But the final will include 20 multiple choice questions, 20 true and false questions, 6 fill in the blank questions, 2 definitions, and 2 short answer questions. Yeah, and I know, yeah, just to come back to the guest lectures, I know there were some questions that Jeff received about how deeply you need to understand the guest lectures. So you need to understand the basic concepts, and if you follow the study guide where we provide you with the keywords, that's the kind of level that we expect you to understand. That'll give you a good guidance as to what we expect, right? We don't expect you to become experts in forest hydrology, but we expect you to understand, the basic issues, the basic concepts that were being talked about. We don't expect you to be statisticians, but we want you to understand that there are certain issues, for example, with paired watershed studies and how that, the thinking has advanced since those times, so that we understand better about the magnitude and frequency of flooding, for example. And we'll include this, the key objectives we want you to know, and then what concepts we want you to understand. Yeah, so I think that probably answers most of the things about the final. And yeah, so I hope that you enjoyed the second half of the course. You'll see in the syllabus that, probably about at least half of the lectures are going to be guest lectures, but I'll be there with you for those lectures, as Jeff will be, and making sure that you all understand and see the flow in the course. So, so before the midterm, we talked a lot about the basics of forest ecosystems. We talked about the carbon cycle, different biogeochemical cycles like the nitrogen cycle. We talked about, yeah, basically how carbon is distributed in forests and across different forest biomes. We talked about disturbance regimes, fire in particular. Then we went on and talked about forest succession, and also the water cycle. So now I want to get into a little bit more about, as we move forward, just about how we actually manage forests, and in different perspectives on forest management, things that go right and things that go wrong, and the implications for global change. We're going to then, as we move along, we'll also be talking about, what at the large scale levels that how people around the world are shaping forests or tending forests or stewarding forests as a way to mitigate climate change, and also some of the things that we're not doing very well and that we can improve upon. And we're going to talk a lot about indigenous knowledge systems, because it's, for one, it's a really much more holistic and healthy way of seeing our natural world and managing it. And I want you to understand why that is, and we'll be contrasting these different knowledge systems. So we'll have different guest lectures coming on, Indigenous people talking about how they see forests and how they manage forests in the past. And we'll make a nice contrast then with what contemporary forest management looks like. And therefore, how can we adopt some of these philosophies and worldviews and ways of looking at and managing forests so that we have better outcomes in mitigating climate change. So I hope you enjoy all this. So let's get started. We're gonna, really starting again with basic ecology, because, and I'm going to start with, species interactions, which go, what is a species interaction? It's really just how species relate to one another, how they interact with one another. It is the one thing that in forest management we manipulate all the time. And we generally don't do a great job at it. And so I want to talk about, where we kind of go off the rails and how we can improve upon this. But, how species compete, collaborate, interact with one another, it is where, it's what builds an ecosystem, and it's also where we kind of go wrong and destroy ecosystems. So let's get into that. So in this lecture, you should be able to name and understand different types of interactions. There's about 7 categories I'm going to talk about. give an example of each one of those types of interactions, understand how these interactions shape forest structure and function. Structure being what it looks like, the function is the processes that are going on inside the forest that make it look like a forest. Understand how forest practices shape or address these interactions. And then I'm going to talk about some of these other more high-level interactions that are very interesting. It's not just two-way interactions, it's many, many rippling effects outward into the ecosystem. And when you have these, higher level or these more multiplicative interactions, we call those higher order interactions. Okay, so I'm going to start with this quote from a famous English poet, and he was so right when he said that thou canst not stir a flower without troubling a star. This just means that you might be affecting something that looks very local and immediate, but it actually has these cascading effects all the way out, all up to even up into the cosmos. And this photo, which was actually taken by Sterling Lawrence, he's actually a mountain biker. He's a famous mountain biker photographer, and he took this photo of the North Shore Mountains outside of Vancouver when he was out mountain biking. And I say that because, he has an eye for a forest ecosystem. This is a beautiful old growth forest. And we are affecting these old growth forests all the time. So here you've got a tree, a whole bunch of trees, understory plants. You can see there's an incredible structure to this forest. There's lots of layers of the canopy. There's a gap in here and then more dense forest. So that's horizontal structure. You know that there's processes going on in here, like how light filters through the canopy and how understory plants then can use that filtered light to photosynthesize. And now we know about carbon and nitrogen and water cycling. We know these trees are all instrumental in taking up CO2, for example, using it in photosynthesis to build their bodies, their structures. We know that they transpire, so water is constantly being emitted by these trees and taken up by their roots. We know that this structure really is what we're looking at is the whole combination of processes that are going on in here, these beautiful processes we've been talking about in this course. And in forest management, we affect these structures by, harvesting trees. Traditionally in the last 30, 50 years, the way forests have been harvested is really to take out all these trees and clear cut them. Or you might high grade certain ones. Like, so if, for example, somebody might want to just, big old cedars because they're extremely valuable, and they'll take out the cedar trees, for example, and then leave some of the hemlocks behind because they're not as valuable. So we do these things, right? And we greatly affect all the processes as we're interacting with the structure. So, and Connell, who was an ecologist back in the 1970s, he says that a local assemblage of organisms, if it's to be regarded as a community or a forest, with some kind of organization, I talked about the horizontal and vertical structure in that stand, that it is the interactions between these organisms that we must look at that provide this structure. How are these trees interacting with each other, with the plants, and even with the physical, of course, with the physical environment too, the soil, the air, the rain, all of them are interacting. And in this course, I've introduced to you a way of thinking about these interactions in complexity theory or complex adaptive systems theory, which is really where ecology has really progressed even since I learned about forest ecology as an undergrad. We never talked about forests in this way. We talked about forests as a bunch of trees. We didn't really talk about them as interacting trees. But now we need to think about forests as complex systems where the trees and all the parts, these oranges in this model, are interacting with each other through competition, cooperation, parasitism, whole myriad of ways. And out of those interactions then emerges the structures and the behaviors of that ecosystem. And that has feedbacks then to either dampen or accentuate those interactions and build the forest over time. Okay, so that's how I want you to be thinking about forests, as a series of interactions. And so let's get into these interactions, these little arrows between the oranges. And before we do that, I just want to, just to emphasize how important understanding this is in contemporary forest management, but also in climate change, which we're all dealing with and we're going to be dealing with for the rest of our lives. So this is an article that came out on February 21st. So that was just, what is today, like the 24th? This is on Friday. And it talks about tree diversity is the key to, so I can't see the behind my little, oh yeah, to forest survival. And so this article goes on, it says, forests with a greater diversity of trees sequester more carbon. And this, in a way, this is not surprising. Different trees employ different survival strategies, a preference for shade or for full sunlight, acidic or basic soils, partnerships with some bacteria and fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, for example, etc. The more strategies one crams into a given forest, the more efficiently the forest resources can be used. So what it's talking about is that trees of these different species have different traits. They have different abilities to grow fast or slow, do well in the shade or in the sun, to take up different compounds of nitrogen or phosphorus, to take up different water in different levels in the soil profile. And it is that diversity that allows the trees to really, take up resources and be very productive. So that's what this is saying. So it says, the theory goes that diversity promotes overall growth, resulting in an accumulation of more plant tissue and sequestered carbon, both above ground and below ground, and that the more species of trees also means more strategies for collecting, recycling, and retaining nitrogen, the most important nutrient for plant growth and the primary limiting factor in Canada's forests. And you could substitute nitrogen for light, water, phosphorus, all the resources that forests and trees need to grow. So here in Canada, it goes on to say conifers tend to grow more quickly, making them a favorite of loggers. But they also possess more flammable resins in their needles and bark than deciduous trees, making them more vulnerable to wildfires, whereas deciduous trees also have higher percentages of moisture in their leaves, which reduces the risk of ignition. And that maintaining a natural blend of conifers and deciduous trees, and he's talking about the forests in the east coast of Canada, but this also applies to the west, would therefore mean sequestering more carbon and suppressing more wildfires. So he's talking about diversity and then how trees interact to create carbon sequestration and, in this case, reducing the risk of wildfire. Okay, so this just came out this week. People are concerned about this because we're manipulating diversity of forests and therefore the interactions between different species of trees that create carbon sequestration, carbon storage, risk to wildfire, and so on. And just to illustrate this, I'm just going to show you, and I'm going to come back to this in a later lecture, but I have a project called the Mother Tree Project, and we've been looking at, across the forests of British Columbia, how species diversity actually affects carbon sequestration and storage. And it really reflects what was just said in that article in the National Observer. So what we looked at was net ecosystem production, which we measured as total ecosystem carbon stocks. And we found that as we increase tree species richness, so richness is just the number of species in a forest, that these things are related and positively related. So the more tree species we have, the more carbon sequestration and storage we have in the ecosystem. that just illustrates what that article just said. We published this back in 2021, but other people have been looking at this also for quite a long time. And this figure on the right illustrates this really nicely. This article is actually of an inland rainforest in British Columbia. It's just a schematic, but it's got different species of trees. There's some cedar trees here, hemlock trees, maple, alder, and you can see that they're in different canopy structures or positions in the canopy. They're able to use light at different wavelengths. Some of them are shade tolerant, like this hemlock. Some are shade intolerant, like this maple or this alder tree. And so they're using light at in different wavelengths, so more fully using the light spectrum to photosynthesize and therefore sequester carbon and store carbon. At the same time, their roots, they root to different depths. Here's this cedar is rooting down deeply. This hemlock has got more shallow roots. This alder tree is very shallow roots. And they're using water and nutrients in these different layers in the soil. So they're more fully able to access those nutrients to then provide for building proteins and carbohydrates and DNA, all the things that a tree needs in order to put on biomass and to sequester and store more carbon. So I think this figure really illustrates very nicely why diversity is so important and why we get this relationship between total ecosystem carbon and tree species richness. The more trees richness, the more carbon sequestration there is. Now, there's a lot of nuances in this article that I could go into, but I'm not going to right now. I will do that at a later time. But this relationship holds across many forests around the world. I guess one nuance I will say is that you might have some forests that don't have high species diversity naturally, but their diversity occurs in different ways. It might not be in tree species diversity, but you might have that diversity in the shrub layer underneath, or you might have it in the soil, or you might have it in the genetic diversity of a single species. But no matter how it comes, the greater diversity, whether species, genetics, structural, functional diversity, does lead to this increase in carbon sequestration and storage. Okay, so here's another article that came out just a year ago. This is June of 2023, and they're talking about in Alberta. And it's basically saying the same thing. And it's kind of interesting because all these studies, when they publish them, they say, oh, it's the first time it's been shown. It's actually been known for quite a long time. But this article is reporting on a journal paper that came out in Nature, which is a very prestigious journal. And they're saying that tree diversity, or the amount and distribution of tree species in a forest, is critical for growth, sustaining biodiversity, building resilience to the effects of climate change. The new study shows it also makes a big difference in the carbon cycle. That is, that the balance created by carbon being absorbed by ecosystems and then returned to the atmosphere through decomposition. So we know, now that we've gone through the carbon cycle, we know about photosynthesis and respiration that comes through, through just plants living or decomposition. Then it goes on to say, unfortunately, though, tree diversity is on the decline at the global scale. And it's a particular problem in Canada. It is in British Columbia, it is in Alberta, it is right across the nation. In Canadian forests, as compared to temperate and tropical forests, tree diversity is low. Well, this is naturally true. It's not a result of forest management, although forest management makes it worse. But the natural diversity of tree species is lower in tropical than arboreal forests arboreal and temperate forests and tropical forests. We talked about this earlier in the term. But like I was just saying, that diversity still exists. It just exists in different parts of the forest ecosystem. In boreal forests, more of the diversity is in the below ground community because that's where nitrogen and phosphorus, nitrogen especially, is limiting. And so the species diversity actually occurs more below ground. Okay, so that's a nuance, but regardless, the key here is that he goes on to say, around the world, tree diversity has been decreasing due to human interference, global change, and harvesting of forests, and so forth. Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit more. And I'm going to talk about this article here. This is an article that came out in Global News last year, and this is still a thing here in BC. This is in British Columbia, and it goes on, it's talking about herbicide spraying in forests. And it says, is the herbicide spraying in the forestry sector raising BC's wildfire risk? So it's quite critical of herbicide spraying. Why do we spray herbicides? I'm going to get into that later in this lecture, but it is a thing, right? We spray herbicides to get rid of plants that we don't like, including deciduous trees, because we're trying to make room for growth of coniferous trees, which are more lucrative. So this is what it's doing, is it's reducing the diversity of the forest. It's also reducing its carbon sequestration capacity and increasing its fire risk. So it's talking about these broadleaf trees. These are considered weeds that get in the way of the money trees, which are primarily pine, spruce, and Douglas fir. They're most lucrative species in British Columbia. Historically, because they grew to such great sizes naturally, and so they've been cut down and made, our economies have made a lot of money from that. But the misguided thinking is if we get rid of the deciduous trees, that we'll have these beautiful conifer plantations. So it says the end goal of all these strategies to grow high density pine plantations that in fact, or fir or spruce, but in fact are very flammable. And so by doing these practices for one goal, which is to make more money from the forest, we've actually increased the risk of fire because we didn't understand, that the diversity and how these species interact with one another is actually what built that beautiful forest in the first place. Okay. So a forest like this is a boreal forest. And what we're looking at, is the result of the interactions between all the species in this forest. So we've got coniferous trees, we have deciduous trees, many species of each one of those categories of trees, and they're interacting with each other, right? So they're competing for light, but they're competing for water, but they're also bringing up water and fixing nitrogen and sharing these resources amongst each other. So they're competing and cooperating at the same time. And this gives us the structure and the function of the forest. Okay, it gives us this beautiful forest. It's how these species are interacting. So, so these interactions are so important. Sorry, I have a hard time with my mouse here. Okay, so when species are interacting, what do we mean by that? It just means that's how they relate to one another. It's like, how do you relate to your friends, right? The trees and all species they relate to one another, they interact with one another by competing, cooperating, or as I'll show you, there's a whole other types of relationships that go on. And they're doing this to get the resources they need, to get the energy they need, to get their needs met for survival and reproduction. Okay, so sometimes it's really helpful to cooperate with your neighbor in order to get the water you need. Or sometimes it's more helpful to compete with them. Or maybe you're doing both of those things at the same time. You could be competing with a neighbor for surface water while bringing water up at depth and sharing it with your neighbor through deeper root systems. It's quite complex. As human beings, we tend to simplify these interactions, and that's where we start to make mistakes. But really, what they're doing is they're interacting, relating to one another in very sophisticated ways to enhance their own ability to survive and reproduce, to increase their fitness, in other words. So how these organisms relate to one another depends on their traits. Okay, so their traits are things like, what is the growth rate? What is the reproductive rate? What is their shade tolerance? What is their tolerance for drought? What is their tolerance for high or low nitrogen availability? What is their tolerance for insect infestations and so on? Okay, so these are all traits, and that determines how species relate to one another. So closely interacting organisms influence one another. either ecologically through their competitive or cooperative relationships, or energetically along trophic ladders, so eating one another, for example, to get their energy, or through genetically through coevolution, through feedbacks. So we'll talk about that in a second. So all of these relationships, these interactions based on their traits, shape the structure and the function of the ecosystem. Okay. Okay, but forest management, as I said, is constantly manipulating these interactions. It's affecting the structures and the functions of the forests, including the diversity and the productivity, including the relationships, by manipulating these interactions. It manipulates these interactions by taking out, for example, certain species it doesn't like I explained with the herbicide spraying. We do this all the time as humans. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a very good thing. In fact, we've, through our fantastic stewardship practices, which we'll be talking about a bit about later, we've actually been able to enhance forest productivity in many ways, not just decrease it. But there is, globally, as our, as populations increase and we become more extractive, we are having some negative effects that are not they're not necessary. We can do better than, in many cases, than what we're doing now. Okay, so let's talk about these interactions. I want to increase your knowledge about, the nuances of these types of interactions. So these include, and I'm just going to, illustrate it to you in a very simple way. If you're thinking about one species interacting with another species, in this case, species one and species two, and you can think of it, maybe it's a maple tree and a cedar tree in Pacific Spirit Park. They're interacting in different ways. So when species one, let's say the maple tree, and species two, the cedar tree, are having positive effects on each other, we call that a mutualism. When they're each having negative effects on each other, we call that competition. When one benefits at the expense of the other, the species two, say the cedar, is benefiting from by predating or parasitizing species one, say the maple, then there's a benefit to species two and a negative effect on species one. That's called a predation or parasitism. And then there's these other more unusual interactions where, species two, our cedar, might be benefiting by its interaction with species one, our maple tree, but having no effect on the maple tree. So maybe species two is having, is maybe it's, at a higher level in the canopy than the maple tree, but it's benefiting the cedar, but it has no effect on the maple because maple has got very low tolerance of shade. We call those +0 interactions a commensalism. Or species two maybe be negatively affected by the interaction, but it has no effect on species one. We call that an amensalism. Or when there's no interaction between two species in close proximity, we call that a neutralism. So here we have 6 different types of interactions. Okay, so let's go get into more detail about what these look like. Okay, and I've got a few pictures here that show some of these things. All right, so let's talk about competition, the first interaction. This is a negative interaction where the two species that are interacting with each other have a negative effect on each other. So this occurs when individuals using the same resources, and we can put these into big buckets like water, light, and nutrients, that they compete if that resource is in short supply. Okay, so they're competing, they're trying to get it from each other. Okay, this idea of competition is considered the major organizing force in forest ecology and in evolution. In fact, it's the very basis of how we understand niche diversification and selection, species selection. Okay, so competition is the interaction then also that dominates how we practice forestry. When we're spraying deciduous trees, it's because we're trying to reduce what we think is their competitive effect on the coniferous trees. So the interaction that dominates forest practices is competition. So here is our polling question for you to answer.
Okay, start. Okay, done. I mean, 82% choose competition, so
Good job.
Yeah.
Okay, competition is the right answer. Okay, so just to talk about evolution for a second, I've talked a lot about ecological interactions, but competition is what is considered what leads to niche diversification in evolutionary sense. And it leads to the specialization of species so that they can coexist. So this is illustrated in this drawing or this figure where you've got two distribution curves. Species 1 is blue, species 2, at the beginning of their evolutionary time together, they're interacting, they have overlap in their niche space. So you could think along this x-axis, maybe it's the moisture continuum in a forest from a dry forest to a wet forest. And here's species 1, maybe this is Douglas fir, and species 2, cedar, are overlapping in their niche space. They're both occupying, an overlapping space on mesic sites, say medium sites. But species 1, the Douglas fir, actually prefers and is most abundant in a drier ecosystem, and cedar, species 2, is more abundant in a wetter ecosystem. But they have this overlap, and it is in this overlapping area that they co-occur, is where they're competing. And the theory is that over time, over many, many periods of time, evolutionary time, they separate and they speciate. They become more distinct species. So species 1, Douglas fir, becomes Douglas fir and it dominates on these drier ecosystems, and species 2 becomes Western red cedar that dominates on these wetter ecosystems over time. Okay, so that's, so it is a hugely important concept in evolution, and and that still isn't, it's still the prevailing theory of the time. It is still very important. So niche diversification, then it is the competition for resources or food that results in the specialization. Natural selection drives these competing species into different patterns of resource use. They separate in ecological time and evolutionary time, so that they're using different niches, but they can coexist because they're in their own little niche, right? They're in their own space. It allows two species or more species to partition certain resources, like this is mine and that's yours, so that they don't outcompete each other. And this is known as the competitive exclusion principle, that you can have these two species separating through their competitive exclusion of one another. Okay, so what then the polling question, this is easy. What interaction is the most important, considered the most important in natural selection, which is, as I said, it's competition. So here's our polling question.
Start. Done. That's great. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, thanks. Okay, so thinking ecologically then, we can also, think about, in evolutionary time, even though these species are differentiating and finding their niche, that in actual ecosystems, and you'll be seeing this when you're going out and doing your assignments, your field assignments, that you're going to see Douglas fir, for example, and Western red cedar standing side by side, even though they might be in a wet ecosystem or a dry one, they do co-occur. But they do in ecological space also, they're competing, and they move from what might be a fundamental opportunity or ability to grow in a range of ecosystems, and they, through competition, they also will actually be pushed out of a space ecologically in real time or in a real ecosystem. So we recognize that there's a fundamental niche of species. So this is what they're capable of occupying. So Douglas fir is evolved to, really like these dry sites, but it actually does, if it had no competitors at all, it would actually occupy, a space that is not just these driest sites, but it overlaps a little bit on these wetter sites. It can actually occur on them if there's no other competitor there. Similarly, cedar also has like quite a wide range. It could fundamentally, it's a fundamental niche, we call it. It could fundamentally occur across a wider range of sites without a competitor. So the fundamental niche is what it's genetically capable of occupying that space. But the realized niches, when you actually put them together, they will compete, and then they kind of truncate, or they push a species out because they're better competitors on that kind of site that they do the best at, where their performance is best in that particular situation. So when you see what you see in the forest isn't what they fundamentally could do, it's the result of them interacting and competing with each other. We call that the realized niche. So here's cedar, its fundamental niche is quite wide, but here with Douglas fir side by side, it's actually not occurring in all the spaces it could because Doug fir outcompetes it on those drier ecosystems. So that is called the realized niche. We can also have complementarity where they overlap and they help each other out. So for example, Douglas fir could be actually, changing the conditions of the forest so that it makes it, a little bit easier for cedar to even encroach upon an area. It might bring water up from deep down and make the surface horizons wetter, where cedar can therefore grow where it might not have otherwise. So this complementarity is their overlap and an expansion of their niches through their interactions. Okay, so this is another example of how niches can diversify, and that we can and also can lead to coevolution, or coevolution allows these species to co-occur. So this is an example of warblers finches. So MacArthur was a famous ecologist. Sorry, they're not warblers, they're warblers, not finches. This is a study done in New England, so eastern US. And these are birds that they're all warblers, but they're different species of warblers. And they all coexist in these New England forests. They are all insect eaters. They're all about the same size. They all coexist on these different trees, but it turns out that they exist, or they thrive in different parts of the canopy of those trees. So they feed in, like this one is feeding in the outer top crown of these trees. This one is feeding mostly in the lower part of the crown. This one is more in the middle part of the crown. This one over here on the far right is on the inside of the crown of the tree. So they're all occupying slightly different niches in this ecosystem. So they're feeding in different positions of the canopy in different manners. They move in different directions. They have different nesting dates. These are all traits of these warblers that allows them, these many species, to coexist through their niche diversification. So this niche diversification can occur in many ways, including the location of the food, the type of the food, the timing of the feeding, the ability to capitalize on extraordinary events. For example, if there's a windstorm and a bunch of branches fall off, some of them might really thrive in those conditions because there might be more insects that are, decomposing those branches, and so therefore those certain species of birds will thrive in those conditions, as an example. Okay, so now other interactions. So I've talked about competition. The next thing I want to talk about is, and I'm sorry about these, I'm not coordinating with these photos very well, but A second type of interaction is the plus interaction, which is our mutualism. So this little flower with a pollinator is a type of mutualism. Okay, so a mutualism is where both partners are benefiting from the relationship. It's a plus interaction. Here, species 1 and species 2 are both benefiting. And here are below 3 different kinds or examples of mutualisms. This is a mycorrhizal mutualism where a fungus and a tree root are interacting, where the tree provides photosynthate and the fungus in association with it brings up nutrients and water from the soil, and so therefore they're both benefiting. They actually both need this interaction. They depend on it. In this case, we have ants that are feeding on aphids. And the way that this works is that the ants will actually herd the aphids to the most productive parts of the plant. And then they protect the aphids while they're feeding on the sugars or the phloem of the plant. And then the honeydew that drips off of the aphid, then the ants actually eat the honeydew. And so in this case, the ant is getting food and the aphid is getting protection. So the aphids actually defend those aphids from other predators, and they also move them around to the most productive part of the plant. So that's a type of mutualism. This pollination between the butterfly and the flower obviously is a mutualism that we all know about. And it's likely that all organisms, all species, will participate in at least one mutualism to fulfill its reproductive and fitness needs. Okay, this kind of interaction, though in forestry, is usually ignored. So the example I told you of, that we're going to spray deciduous trees to make way for conifers ignores the fact that actually these deciduous trees provide pollinators, for example, or habitat for pollinators that the conifers need. So we tend to ignore these. So here's our polling question. What interaction is largely ignored in forest practices?
Start. Done. Pretty good.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to go through one more slide and then we'll take a little break. I know that we're so I just wanted to mention that there's different types of mutualisms. Just put a little finer point on mutualisms. We can define them, we can characterize them. So here's some important ways to do that. Some mutualisms are just pairwise. They only involve 2 species. So we call those are monogamous mutualisms. So for example, you could have one mycorrhizal fungus and one tree species, and that's it, right? They just have their mutualisms with each other. Or you can have diffuse mutualisms where a species might have more than one partner. So a Douglas fir, for example, actually associates with over 2,000 species of mycorrhizal fungus. We call that a diffuse mutualism. Most mutualisms, in fact, are diffuse. It provides insurance in case you lose one of your mutualists, right? Of the 2,000 species, let's say one of the fungal species died out. Well, each you've got like 1,999 more species that you can get those services from. They can be asymmetric. For example, you can be more benefit to one of the species than to the other. For example, the fungus really needs that photosynthate to survive, but a Douglas fir might be able to just get its nutrients from its roots. So they can be asymmetric, like one benefits more than the other. They can be obligate. So in other words, they completely depend on each other or not. And if they're not completely dependent, we call them facultative, that they can survive outside of the relationship. Okay, so in this example, I said ectomycorrhizal fungi usually are obligate. You need the fungus and the tree need each other. They can't survive without. They're usually diffuse, that there's more than one partner. And they're usually asymmetric, that the tree gets or the fungus gets an outsized benefit from the tree. Okay, so that's an example. So let's just take a little break and we'll come back. I'm going to give you a very short break of 3 minutes. We'll see you at noon. Okay, so That was a really short break. Okay, so I also wanted to distinguish for you the difference between mutualism and symbiosis. So usually people think these are synonymous or equal, but there is a subtle difference between them. A symbiosis is the living together of different organisms, usually in close association with one another, and it's usually to the benefit of at least one of them, not necessarily both. And remember, mutualism is where they both benefit. And I've got this little cartoon here with the arrow and anyway. So the symbiosis, the word actually means living together, that they have to live together. And they can, like I said, they're often mutualism. So here is a picture of a lichen, which is a mutualism between a fungus and an algae. Okay, that's definitely a symbiosis. They're living together and it's a mutualism. They both benefit. But a parasitism can also be a symbiosis. So here you've got a honey mushroom. It's an armillaria that is infecting a tree. They're living together. They're in close association. It is a symbiosis. It's just that one's benefiting and the other one is not. Or a commensalism, where one benefits and has no effect on the other. That's also a type of symbiosis. In this case, a licorice fern growing on a maple tree. That's a symbiosis. Or here's an amensalism that is also a symbiosis, where in this case we have an infection by a staphylococcus, and it's interacting with penicillin, and it's having this, the penicillin is having a negative effect on the staphylococcus, but it's actually having no effect. The staphylococcus is having no effect on the penicillin. This is an amensalism. They're growing close together, but one's benefiting and the other is having no effect. Okay, so that's the difference between those. And I also wanted to just highlight one of the most famous people who studied symbioses was Lynn Margulis. She has since passed away. She defined symbiosis as an association throughout a significant portion of the life history of an organism. And she came up with this theory called the endosymbiotic theory, which has actually become, the norm of how we think about how evolution happens. It is based on the interdependence and cooperative existence of multiple prokaryotic organisms. Okay, so this is where one organism engulfed the others. This is way back in evolutionary time during prokaryotic evolution into eukaryotes, where one organism engulfed, or one prokaryote engulfed another one, and they survived and eventually evolved to become eukaryotic cells. So here we have this ancestral prokaryote. It is engulfing, in this case, an aerobic bacterium or a cyanobacterium, and they are become part of the body of that prokaryote and evolved into a eukaryotic cell, where the aerobic bacterium eventually became the mitochondria, and the cyanobacteria, the chloroplast, and that ended up being a plant cell. So that didn't used to be the theory of evolution, but now it is. It's really endosymbiosis, which is considered to be one of the most important forces in evolution. In fact, when they first did the Human Genome Project, where they did the first sequencing of a whole human genome, they found that a significant portion of the human genome is actually of bacterial or viral origin. It really confirmed or affirmed what Lynn Margulis had been saying all along, that evolution really is, we as eukaryotes, we're a consortium of different organisms. We're not just individual. We think we're all individual people, but we're just really a bag of bacteria and fungi and viruses, and that are interacting and co-occurring. In this Human Genome Project really showed that. Okay, I want to, just as an aside, Lynn Margulis was ridiculed for her endosymbiotic theory back in the 1960s, and she couldn't get her papers published. It actually took her 20 tries to get her theory published in a journal. But now it's become mainstream thinking. Okay, so let's move on from that little history lesson to, symbiosis is so important in nature. We focus on competition, but mutualisms and symbioses are, really important. And in fact, they reduce the intensity of competitive interactions. We focus on reducing it through taking out species, but really, like the symbiosis actually is doing that for us at the same time. So competition is reduced by symbiotic interactions, such as parasitisms, which can reduce population levels, right? It can take out individuals and they don't compete with each other as much. Competition is usually accompanied by positive symbioses. So, for example, like, Douglas fir, it's a very competitive tree. It shades out other trees, but it is completely beholden to its symbioses with bacteria and fungi in the soil. So even as it's competing, it's in this very symbiotic mutualistic environment or condition as well. And even as it's shading out its neighbors, it's actually getting through its mycorrhizal networks, which I talked about previously, it's actually getting subsidies of photosynthate from other trees, even as it's competing with them. And so it's not all just at face value. There's many things going on all at once, many kinds of interactions. Not only can it be receiving subsidies of carbon, it can also be sending out subsidies of carbon to its neighbors, even as it's competing with them for shade and light. Okay, so this symbiosis also not only changes the ecology and structure of forests, but it results in niche diversification. So the symbioses themselves can also cause, evolution to proceed, as I talked about with Lynn Margulis's theory. Okay, so let's go on to the next interaction. The next one I wanted to talk about is the positive-negative interaction, which we can think of as predation or parasitism, where one species is actually parasitizing or predating on another species. So it's having a positive interaction, but the other species is a negative one. So here in this case, this big fish is eating this little species that's obviously, it's a predator. Or this wood tick could be, infecting you and parasitizing on you. So it's a positive effect for the tick, but it's not so great for you. Okay, so so these kinds of interactions, these plus minuses, is when one organism eats or absorbs nutrients from another. It will increase the fitness of the consumer, but decrease the fitness of the victim. It includes, different kinds of plus minus interactions that we call herbivory. For example, here's a koala eating a plant. So the koala is doing great, the plant not so great. Parasitism, this is a mistletoe parasitizing a pine tree. The mistletoe is getting photosynthate, but the pine tree is probably it's being sapped by this parasitism. Or predation, this grizzly bear eating a salmon. And I've given you a few YouTube video links down here. I encourage you to look at them in your spare time, and so that you can see some lovely examples of these. Organisms have evolved defenses against these interactions, like constitutive defense enzymes or induced defenses, where they conjure them up inside of themselves when they're being predated on, for example. Or they can use biomimicry to hide or to escape from this predatory or parasitic interaction. Parasitism, so here in this case, this is the mountain pine beetle. The beetle is parasitizing on lodgepole pine trees. This is something that extended across our forest landscapes for about 10 years in an epidemic outbreak. And we have many of these kinds of outbreaks, parasitic outbreaks that happen in forestry. And the response in forestry is, oh, well, we've got to get rid of the predator. In fact, we're going to get rid of also all the trees, and that therefore we can control this parasitic behavior. When in fact, these kinds of epidemics and endemics are going on all the time, and they create balance over short and long periods of time. But we often overreact to these kinds of parasitic interactions in forests and overmanage them. So here's our polling question. What interaction most often overmanaged in forestry?
Start. Done.
Great, thank you. Good. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the next, the final two types of interactions, which are amensalism and commensalism. So a commensalism is where we have one species benefiting, and then it has no effect on the other species. And so let's just go into this in more detail. So one organism in the relationship is inhibited or destroyed, and the other is unaffected. And there's two kinds. One-sided competition, where one plant completely outcompetes another plant, or an antibiosis or allelopathy, where one of the organisms will actually secrete a chemical or a poison that will kill the other one, or at least reduce its growth, while it itself is unharmed. So a really good example of this is, so here is a black walnut tree. It actually excretes, I think it's called juglans is the chemical, and it actually poisons any other plant that might try to grow underneath that tree. And it inhibits their root development. So these are examples of amensalism. Sorry. And then the last one, sorry, is commensalism, where there's a positive zero interaction. And this is where one of the organisms is benefited and the other one is unaffected. And there's four kinds that I'm going to talk about of this commensalism. So one is a chemical commensalism, and this is where, in this case of this example up here, where a bacteria might feed on the waste products of another plant. So here is a bacterium that's engulfing the waste products of another bacterium, and therefore it's benefiting, but that one bacteria, the blue one, is benefiting, but whatever excreted the red stuff is having no effect on it. So that's called a chemical commensalism. An aninqualism is where one species will live on the body of another one. So in this case, we have licorice fern growing on, and mosses growing on a maple tree. And the licorice fern or the mosses are both benefiting from living on the tree. They're probably getting some food, some carbohydrate that's leaking out of the bark, and nutrients. But the tree itself is not being affected. It's growing quite happily with or without these epiphytes. So this is called this type of commensalism is called an aninqualism. Or a metabiosis is another type of commensalism, where one species will unintentionally create a home on another species. So for example, a nest is being built on the branch of a tree. That obviously the bird is going to greatly benefit from this nest, but the tree itself, there's no negative effect on the tree. Or a FRST is another type of commensalism, where one species is benefiting on another by using it as a mode of transportation. Okay, so now I'm going to move into a little bit of a case study of how we've been managing these kinds of interactions in forests. I mentioned that, we often overreact to parasitisms by clear cutting, or we might just do it with or without that parasitism. And then we kind of overmanage the resulting forest to get what we want, which is like more money for future forest harvesting. And the consequences are enormous, right? It's an enormous effect on the carbon budget, on global climate change, on species diversity. Forestry practices themselves are one of the biggest impacts on these two things in nature than most any other land management that we do other than burning of fossil fuels. So let's just talk a little bit about that. In this case, you can see that in this landscape, this clear-cutting effect is simplified the structure of the forest by converting them from, what were probably multiple age classes and species diversity to one age class, which is what was, the recent harvesting. And because we often plant back one species or a couple species and then try to get rid of the deciduous trees, we also simplify the diversity at the stand level, for our economic goals. And so we often forget, that these species are there for reasons other than just for us, our human needs, and that many species together, not only do they increase the productivity and the sort of resistance to fire, for example, there's a certain redundancy, if you will, among species that gives insurance to an ecosystem. So what do we mean by redundancy? Redundancy is just a repetition of species that might perform a similar process. I mentioned the thing about, Douglas fir has got 2,000 species of mycorrhizas. Well, they all have a special niche, but there is some overlap in, their abilities to take up nitrogen or phosphorus or magnesium or water. We call that overlap redundancy. And there's these theoretical relationships between redundancy of species and function of the ecosystem. This is expressed in what people call the redundancy hypothesis, which says that the functioning of the ecosystem, that would be along the y-axis, or you could think of carbon sequestration or carbon storage or productivity. That functioning, as you add more and more species, think of mycorrhizal fungi, for example, at some point, because of the overlap in their abilities to do things, it flattens out their increasing impact on that performance of that forest or that productivity. That flattening of the curve is what is called redundancy. But this repetition, actually produces stability in these ecosystems. It gives them flexibility. So if you have many species, as I mentioned before, performing a similar function and you lose 1 or 5 species, there's others there that can take over. The other thing to think about is that these species are not just doing one thing in an ecosystem. They have a multi-dimensional niche, right? They do many things at once. So even though, say, a mycorrhizal fungus can bring up nitrogen, it can also protect a root against a pathogen infection in different ways. So even though you might get rid of species that are doing that one thing, like bringing up nitrogen, you're actually affecting all that multitude of other ecosystem functions that they're performing. And so by having many species that overlap in a certain function, but they all do something slightly different in other ways, it provides a lot of stability in that ecosystem that, when you do lose something, that there's a lot of insurance, there's a lot of repetition that can be counted on, and that it also allows them to perform multiple functions at once. So this repetition allows for the preservation of vital processes, even if species are lost or added or altered or have their variability in function. And ecologists often call this redundancy nature's insurance policy. And we need to watch out because often this redundancy in nature is used as an excuse to homogenize ecosystems. We say, oh, we've got lots of species doing that function. We can afford to lose something. In fact, because they're serving multiple roles, that's not really true. And so a better way of understanding, how losing ecosystems or losing species in ecosystems really works is what is better expressed in what's called the rivet hypothesis. And the rivet hypothesis says that species are more like rivets in an airplane. So an airplane is all tied together by, little screws and bolts and rivets. Each one of them plays a small but critical role in keeping the plane, or the ecosystem in our case, flying. And you can lose a few rivets, and that you might be able to limp along. but you might lose a critical rivet that would actually, cripple the airplane's ability to function. And the whole lesson here is that there are actually limits or thresholds to which we can lose species before the whole system actually starts to fall apart. And, it actually doesn't take that long before, like, removing deciduous, like aspen trees, it actually causes the ecosystem to unravel, even because we've taken this very simplistic view. It affects the total ecosystem function more so than the redundancy hypothesis suggests. I know we've run out of time, so I guess I'll let you go, and I'll finish off these little bits next time. But yeah, I hope you have a good afternoon, and we'll see you on Wednesday. Thanks.